Puppeteer's Curse. Chapter 1. The Marionette's Arrival. The phone call came on a dreary Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day that seemed to press the color out of the world. Retired Detective Henry Faulkner, who had spent his life chasing shadows and unmasking the hidden faces of the city, found himself squinting at the legalese of a letter, a bequest from a name he couldn't recall ever having helped or hindered. A peculiar inheritance, a marionette of all things, with no explanation aside from the solemn declaration that it was of great importance to the safety of many. Henry, a man not prone to superstition, placed the marionette on his mantelpiece, an odd contrast to his collection of old case files and dusty plaques. That night, as the clock ticked a somber lullaby, the puppet stirred. It was a subtle shift, barely noticeable, but enough to send a chill down Henry's spine. By morning, the marionette's painted eyes seemed to follow him, its wooden limbs poised in a silent plea for motion. The first incident was a mere accident, or so Henry tried to convince himself. A neighbor, a kindly old woman named Mrs. Withers, came by to borrow some sugar and found herself dancing a waltz in the middle of the living room, her feet moving against her will. It was only when Henry locked eyes with the marionette that her dance came to a stumbling halt. Henry couldn't ignore the thread of dread that was weaving its way through his thoughts. He spent the night with a bottle of scotch and his police instincts, watching the marionette for any sign of life. When morning broke, he was no closer to understanding the situation, but he was certain of one thing: the puppet was not just a puppet. It held power, a power that had somehow chosen him as its next bearer. His fingers brushed against the grain of the wood, and he made a decision. Henry Faulkner, the man who had faced down murderers and thieves with nothing but his wits, would not be controlled by a wooden doll. He would find out where this cursed object had come from and why it had come to him. And so the investigation began anew, with stakes unlike any Henry had ever known. Chapter 2. The Puppet's Whisper. The day's light spilled over the clutter of Henry's study as he delved into the history of his uncanny inheritance. Piles of dusty tomes and newspapers, borrowed from the local library, surrounded him. But it was an old article that caught his eye, speaking of a puppeteer whose shows mesmerized entire towns, only for them to wake to robbery or worse. The article mentioned a marionette that could steal the will of men. It was during his meticulous research that Henry encountered Eliza Vaughn, a historian of the occult with sharp eyes and a sharper intellect. She had been tracking the tale of the puppeteer's marionette for years, intrigued by its dark folklore. With her knowledge of ancient curses and Henry's detective prowess, they formed an unlikely but determined alliance. As they examined the puppet, Eliza pointed out the sigils carved into its frame, symbols of control and bondage, faded with age but still thrumming with a sinister energy. Henry felt the marionette's gaze, its wooden jaw creaking open as if to speak. The room chilled, and the marionette's strings writhed like serpents in the air. It whispered of a pact made long ago, a curse it yearned to be free from. With each clue pieced together, the trail led to a long-abandoned theater on the outskirts of the city, where the puppeteer had performed his final act. Eliza and Henry stood before the dilapidated facade, the air heavy with the scent of decay and old varnish. Inside, they found a hidden workshop, walls lined with lifeless marionettes, all except one, a vacant stand with the same sigils that marked Henry's unwelcome gift. Within the bowels of the theater, amidst props and costumes ravaged by time, they unearthed diaries, chronicles of the puppeteer's descent into madness and his dealings with forces he could not control. The puppet, it seemed, was more than a tool. It was a vessel, one that required a master, or it would find one itself. Back at Henry's home, the puppet's control grew stronger, coercing actions from Henry that filled him with revulsion. It was clear the puppet sought release from its binds, but at what cost? Eliza and Henry needed to unravel the full extent of the curse before it was too late, for the puppeteer's dark legacy was not merely to control, but to consume the very soul of its host. Tension gripped Henry's heart as the marionette's eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. The curse was alive, a force that would not be ignored. The puppet was more than an heirloom. It was a test, a riddle wrapped in shadows, and Henry had always been drawn to the unraveling of mysteries. This one, however, bore consequences more dire than any he had faced before. Chapter 3. The Final Act. Henry's sleep was fractured by nightmares, visions of strings pulling at his limbs, dragging him deeper into a void where whispers clawed at the edges of his sanity. He awoke to find Eliza poring over ancient texts, her face illuminated by the flicker of candlelight. She believed she had found a ritual that might sever the puppet's bond, but it required an object of equal antiquity and power. The object in question was an amulet, once worn by the puppeteer himself, believed to house the essence of his control. According to the diaries, the amulet had been buried with him, a tradition meant to contain his influence. They had to exhume the puppeteer's grave. Under the cloak of night, they found the resting place. As Henry's shovel struck wood, the ground beneath them trembled, as if warning them away. In the decayed coffin, the amulet pulsed with a dark energy, its stones cold as they closed their hands around it. The puppet had become eerily silent, its strings slack, but its carved eyes followed their every move. Henry felt a taut pull in his mind, the puppet fighting back, its desire to live free of constraints clashing with the power of the amulet. With the amulet and the puppet before them, Eliza began the ritual. Words of ancient tongues filled the room, and a wind whipped through the house, slamming doors, shattering windows. The puppet's silhouette danced in the chaos, its strings slicing through the air. Henry's voice joined Eliza's chants, his willpower the final component needed to bind the puppet once again. As the ritual reached its climax, the puppet levitated, its form convulsing. Henry could feel its hold on him weakening, his own movements returning to his command. With a final incantation, a flash of light engulfed the room, and the strings disintegrated, falling to the floor like ash. The marionette's wood cracked, its cursed life ebbing away. In the silence that followed, Eliza and Henry regarded the inert marionette. The amulet lay beside it, dull and lifeless. They had succeeded, but the victory was somber. The puppeteer's curse was broken, but the echoes of his madness would linger in the memories of those it had touched. Henry placed the puppet in a box, alongside the remains of its strings and the now powerless amulet. It would be sealed away, hidden from those who might seek its dark magic. Eliza proposed they guard its legacy together, ensuring its silence. As dawn broke, Henry and Eliza stood before the fireplace, watching as the box containing the marionette and its relics turned to cinders. The puppeteer's final act concluded not with applause, but with the quiet promise of two guardians watching over a world that remained unaware of how close it had come to a puppeteer's sinister encore. And thus, the curtain fell on the puppeteer's curse, the marionette's whispers fading into legend, with Henry Faulkner and Eliza Vaughn, the unsung heroes who ensured that this particular performance would never be reprised.